Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Stephanie Fay, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Global Engagement of Monash University, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the panel discussion, Mission Accomplished, the Death of Osama Bin Laden and What It Means for Global Terrorism. Tonight we discuss the death of one of our generation's faces of terrorism and what this means for global terrorism. Our eminent panel, under the guidance of our expert moderator, will explore the intersection between law, human rights and politics as it relates to global terrorism. So I'm delighted to welcome our moderator, Professor Greg Barton. Based at Monash's School of Political and Social Inquiry, he's acting director of our Centre for Islam and the Modern World, and Deputy UNESCO Chair in Interreligious and Intercultural Relations, Asia Pacific. As an active member of Monash's Global Terrorism Centre, Professor Barton has a keen interest in counter-terrorism, security studies and human security. Amongst many of his teaching subjects sits interfaith relations in the 21st century in the newly developed Masters of Islamic Studies. Concurrently with his time at Monash, Professor Barton is involved in teaching several counter-terrorism courses each year at the Asia Pacific Centre for Security Studies in Hawaii. Professor Barton was a founding member of the editorial board of Dialogue Australasia, the first magazine in the Asia Pacific region dedicated to building public understanding about religious communities and traditions and their common humanitarian concerns. In Jakarta, Professor Barton was a founding board member of the Wahid Institute, an NGO along similar lines to the Carter Center in the US. It promotes religious tolerance, progressive Islamic thought, human rights, and growing understanding between Islam and the West. He's working on 2 new book projects, one entitled Progressive Islamic Thought and Social Movements in Indonesia and Turkey, and the other, Islam's Other Nation, a fresh look at Indonesia. Professor Barton, thank you for joining us tonight. I'd now like to introduce tonight's panel members. Firstly, Professor Sarah Joseph. She's the Director of the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law at Monash. Her teaching and research interests are international human rights law and constitutional law. She's currently leading a Caston Centre project preparing headnotes on all UN human rights cases for the Oxford Reports in International Law. Professor Joseph has published a number of books, including Corporations and Transnational Human Rights Litigation, Human Rights Translated, a Business Reference Guide, and a handbook on the individual complaints procedures of the UN, as well as publishing numerous articles and presenting many papers. Her most recent book is titled Blame It on the WTO, a Human Right Critique. Professor Joseph has also conducted numerous professional human rights training courses for overseas and Australian government officials. Her current scholarly paper, Social Media, Human Rights and Political Change, examines the role of social media in progressive political change in the light of its use in the recent Arab Spring uprisings. So please join me and welcome Professor Sarah Joseph. Dr. Gideon Boaz is an Associate Professor in the Law Faculty. He's an expert in international criminal justice, international law and international humanitarian law. He was the Senior Legal Officer at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where he was the Senior Advisor to the trial chamber in the Milosevic case. Dr. Boaz has consulted for a range of governments, including the Australian Federal and Victorian government departments, as well as the United Kingdom Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He has also consulted for the international organisations and NGOs, writing briefing papers and providing training. He's been pro bono legal counsel for the accused war criminal Radovan Karadzic and has provided expert advice on extradition and other matters. Dr. Boas has published many books, book chapters and articles on international criminal law and justice, and his latest book, Public International Law, Contemporary Principles and Perspectives, is in press. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gideon Boas. So our final panel member is Dr. Benjamin McQueen from the School of Political Science and Social Inquiry. Dr. McQueen's research and teaching interests include the theory and practice of conflict resolution, politics and society in the Middle East and North Africa, international relations of the Middle East, international relations theory, US and Australian foreign and security policy, the UN and Islamic politics. Dr. McQueen is a regular media commentator. He's written for The Age, the Herald Sun newspapers, and appears frequently on many stations including ABC TV and radio, SBS TV and radio, Radio Singapore International, 3AW Melbourne, 3GB Sydney, Triple J and Radio Australia. Recent book publications of Dr. McQueen's include Political, Cultural and Conflict Resolution in the Arab World, Lebanon and Algeria, and the co-authorship of Islam and the Question of Reform, Critical Voices from Muslim Communities. We welcome Dr. Benjamin McQueen.
I won't speak for myself, but my panel members, I can say fulsomely, are terribly interesting and important and have a great grasp on the intricacies of these issues. And we could have a series of lectures tonight that would, I think, be very valuable, but we're not going to have lectures. We're not even going to have necessarily little briefs. We're going to try and move fairly quickly into a conversation with the panel first of all, and then a conversation with the floor, with all of you. So in the latter part of the program, we'll take questions from the floor. To keep it lively, we'll ask that you keep the questions to 60 seconds. So nice, pithy questions, perhaps rather than statements, but a chance to flesh out some of the things we raised now. We're going to start with the Bin Laden raid, which was surprising. It happened without warning, and it I think, produced mixed emotions. We sort of felt a sense of excitement and even relief, but also pondering the ethical and legal issues. It also raised a lot of awkward questions and difficult questions, not just for that raid itself, but also for what we've been doing the last 10 years in the so-called war on terror and what lies ahead. So we're going to start with that raid itself, the issues around it, and then build out from there, ending up looking at what the death of Bin Laden means for the terrorist threat today, and what lessons we can draw from the last decade in terms of how we respond to that threat. What should we do? What's the ethical and right thing to do? I'll start with you, Sarah. Your thoughts on the Bin Laden raid. How did you feel when you heard that news? What went through your head?
I mean, I definitely felt excited. It was a real moment in time. But once I had time to reflect on it, even despite all the... I was quite shocked at the partying in the streets in the United States that happened. I guess in retrospect that wasn't so surprising. But I think it's important, even when... fighting something as heinous as terrorism and trying to capture someone like Osama Bin Laden, who himself has, exhibited no respect for human life and no respect for human rights. I think it's very important that states retain their moral compass, retain their commitment to international law. And the more I've reflected on the Bin Laden raid, I think there are serious questions that can be raised regarding the invasion of Pakistani sovereignty, the law of armed conflict, if it applies, and if it doesn't apply, then there are serious questions with international human rights law. So even despite all the euphoria, and we even had people like Ban Ki-moon almost congratulating the United States on what happened, so there aren't many prominent people saying this was wrong, I would question the legality of a lot of what happened.
Did we break the law, Gideon? Was it a case of just taking a shortcut through the law?
Well, we didn't break the law, but the United States certainly broke the law. I'd like to reinforce what Sarah said about the event itself. It is one of those where were you at the time moments, in the same way as I think the felling of the Twin Towers was a where were you at the time moment. And I remember where I was in both events. And I think on a primal level, like Sarah, I felt a sort of sense of satisfaction, almost excitement at the idea that finally this, emblem of evil of the modern times had been brought down. But the more one reflects on the meaning of what happened and how it happened, the more one is troubled by the legality of it and deeper than that, the morality of it. And I know we'll get to that a bit more further on. Lawfully, yes, I think there was a breach of law, and we'll talk a little bit about the various legal disciplines that are relevant to the targeting of bin Laden. But targeting killing is something that is available in very restricted circumstances under international law, and none of those circumstances, I think, were met in this instance. So while we had Obama, while we had Ban Ki-moon, while we had Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd and many of the world's leaders saying that this was a great expression of justice, I think the reality is that it was anything but the sort of conception of justice that we want to stand for in, we might refer to it as Western democracy.
Well, Ben, the President Obama, apparently agonised over the decision for multiple reasons. There were lots of difficult aspects to that decision. If you were in his team advising him, and let's hope he gets re-elected, he's looking for youthful energy in his second administration, perhaps he may come calling on you. If you were in his team earlier this year when this decision was being made, what pitch would you have put to him in terms of the options available?
I mean, purely strategic terms, they did what they wanted to do. There's some question about if it was a kill or capture order. He got more political currency and traction out of doing it the way he did it. And the way he packaged his response seemed to confirm that that's what he was going for. I mean, there's intense legal ambiguity about the act itself. And that wasn't going to be resolved by acting a different way, I don't think. I mean, to get bin Laden, he would have had to have gone into Pakistan, and to do that legally, there's all implications in terms of consulting with the Pakistani government, etc. So I think he hedged his bets, and if I was an advisor, I'm being paid to advise him to give him the most political capital. I probably would have advised him, as unethical as it was, to follow that road, because he gained that political traction out of it. But I think that tells us a lot about the act itself. It tells us that it does sail very close to the margins of legality, and it really does capture the broader ambiguities around the war on terror, the broader acts of the US in terms of other actions they've been taking in Pakistan and Afghanistan as well, and in Iraq. I mean, all these things sort of flow out. I think it was a tactical, political, strategic set of decisions that have achieved tactical, positive results for the administration. So
your advice would have been, once they identified, they had the intelligence saying it's highly likely that bin Laden is in Abbottabad. We think we know the exact location. Was it inevitable that there would be a raid launched?
Yeah, act unilaterally, I think. I'm not saying I'm in favour of that, but you can see, if you're operating within the confines of the government, the US administration in that advisory capacity, you can see the logic of their decision. And it would have been very difficult to impose a more, ethical set of decision-making praxis on that, I think.
I think Geoffrey Robertson QC suggested they should have sent in I don't know whether these were his exact words, but a crack team of international law experts. Gideon, if you were invited to join that flight, I mean, what could have been realistically done apart from sending in the Navy SEALs? What else could they have done?
Well, I suppose there are a range of political opportunities open to the administration, one of which Ben referred to, which was consulting with the Pakistan government and seeking their intervention and then seeking an extradition from them, all of which is fraught with dreadful legal complications, let alone the enormous political and security implications that has. But setting that aside momentarily and setting the political aspect of it aside and looking at the legality of it, there is certainly a basis upon which one would have sought his arrest. And why not send the Navy SEAL team in and arrest him? The initial information coming out of the raid was that, he was armed with an AK-47 and they shot and killed him. And that sounded like a perfectly reasonable and legitimate action to take. As it turned out, it doesn't appear that that was the case at all, and that the team was sent in to assassinate him, and that's exactly what they did. They could have arrested him. They could have transferred him by helicopter back to American territory and tried him in the United States. And that has all sorts of jurisdictional complications to it, none of which are fatal and all of which were possible. But if you look at the plight of other dictators or other leaders branded with this evil, there are certainly others who have been subjected to criminal justice in a range of jurisdictions, and the most obvious is former dictators like Slobodan Milosevic or Saddam Hussein or Charles Taylor. If they don't kill him beforehand, then Muammar Gaddafi. There are ways of dealing with these people in accordance with the rule of law, and simply going in and killing our enemies would not be my ideal response to those circumstances. So if I was a member of the legal team, then I would be, speaking in favour of having him arrested and trying him before a court of law. What about if you were on that Black Hawk helicopter and they dropped you in the compound? Can you see that perhaps in the circumstances as we now understand them, that maybe they had no option but to shoot when he lunged, apparently in the direction of a weapon or a kill switch? There may well be. It's very difficult to know, and I don't think we'll ever know what truly happened. But, one can envision a range of circumstances in which they were entitled and appropriately responded in shooting and killing him. It appears as though that was always the purpose of the raid, and so one was left with the suspicion that there was no intention of ever arresting him, if that was indeed possible. Yeah, my understanding, for what it's worth, is that the intention was to take him alive if they could, but the chances of that happening was slender, because unless he was on the floor kneeling with his hands in the air, you would assume he might have, for example, wired his house, his compound, may have been wearing an explosive jacket. It turns out he wasn't. And of course, there are other people who could have been taken hostage, family members, but they lost a helicopter on the raid and they didn't have the capacity to take those people out. But the fact that the helicopter was there suggests maybe they had this in mind. Ben, was it a kill mission, or were they sort of arrest if you can, kill if you can't?
I get this very strong sense it was a kill mission. I would almost say certainly a kill mission from the information that I have, which is pretty much all open source information, but it's hard to see what elements of what happened show it being anything other than that, as Gideon was saying. The intent seemed pretty clear. You can take a glib example like Obama's statement when he was first elected in 2008 that he will kill Osama Bin Laden. He came out and said this. This could have just been a sort of a bit of machismo or something like that, trying to sort of shore up his perceived foreign policy and security weakness. But I can't see any indication that they were going in there with the intent of capturing him and trying him. This also came in the wake of the difficulty he has faced in shutting down Guantanamo Bay, bringing inmates there into the United States. The Khalid Sheikh Mohammed case, for instance, that fell apart in process. So there was no mechanism there to do it either.
Was Bin Laden that important? Was he really playing an active role? What does the evidence that was found in the house afterwards suggest?
Not a great deal. And this was sort of popping through my head when you were talking about the reactions. This was my first reaction. There was a sort of sense of shock, obviously, but it was that initial question of, well, does this actually matter? What does this actually mean? And this is something that I'm sure you guys can talk more about, but it is consequential, his level of control in terms of the legal status of him actually being killed. Was he an enemy commander? Was he actually in control of anything anymore? Because if he wasn't, and there's no real clear evidence at the moment, then that raises questions over the legality of him being killed.
Another set of issues that comes up in this, some made the claim after the raid that the raid was only possible because of intelligence gained through what they call enhanced interrogation techniques, torture, waterboarding, other forms of torture. But other members of the administration, you get the sense the President himself, General David Petraeus, have come out very explicitly and said that there's no grounds for torture, or what may be called enhanced interrogation techniques. Does the evidence of this case suggest that there was something to be gained from torture? Do we have any sort of evidence that they did this because of material they got speaking to people under duress?
I mean, it seems like the intelligence that contributed to them finding Bin Laden came from a variety of sources. They have said that waterboarding ceased in 2006, so if there was evidence, then it came from 5 years ago. The administration has not been clear. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld came out and said, no, it wasn't waterboarding. Then he very quickly changed his mind. My comment about that would be that if waterboarding has contributed, it's contributed some small piece of the jigsaw, but in my view that doesn't actually still justify the use of torture. The arguments in favour of using torture as a weapon in the war on terror have generally focused on this sort of apocryphal example of the ticking time bomb, that there's some nuclear bomb hidden in
the sort of the 24 scenario.
Yeah, and this wasn't a ticking time bomb. He's a very bad man, but they actually knew, they suspected and virtually knew he was where he was for about 8 months. And so this is really conflating the torture argument to say, yes, it's justified to use torture if we find out anything that's useful. If we find any bad man, if we find, if it's convenient, and that's just it's a cliche to say that it's a slippery slope argument, but I think it's a perfect example of it. I would also add on the use of torture that I think there are some members of the Bush administration who might at a personal level be regretting that now, because I do believe Human Rights Watch has come out this week and called on other countries to, if they can get their hands on them, to try George Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld and so on. And I don't actually see that happening, but I do see that their travel in the future could be seriously constrained. That if they travel to other countries, they could find that at the very least they might face an investigation. In fact, there was an example last year where George Bush was supposed to go to Switzerland and deliver a speech. He didn't, and I can't remember the actual excuse he gave, but the strong suspicion was that there was an NGO in Switzerland that was ready to slap a torture writ on him, and had that happened, he would have ended up like Roman Polanski, stuck in Switzerland.
Right. That's a connection I haven't seen, but I can see your point from the argument of law, that law has, in this case, we see the power of law to sort of put the spotlight on things and to flush things out. And of course we live, dare I say, in the age not just of WikiLeaks, but also of other tapes and releases from, at the moment, News of the World is the case that's being discussed. So stuff may well come out that people find embarrassing.
Can I just comment on a couple of things? One was, I think one of you said that, well, we will never know what happened. As far as I know, the Navy SEALs actually had cameras, and there's that iconic photo of everyone in the White House watching what's going on. So I think there's actually very good evidence of exactly what happened. I'm not sure it'll ever be released, but there is very good evidence. And on the issue of killing Bin Laden, if it was, and I'll talk from the point of view of international human rights law, and assuming that there is no armed conflict, which is a slightly different issue, I will say that the United States just assumes there is an armed conflict between the United States and Al-Qaeda. Well, that's extremely controversial. That's not an open and shut case. If there is no armed conflict, then human rights law applies in full. A kill operation is completely a breach. So if I assume that it's a kill and capture operation, I think you were alluding to this, Greg. There is an argument that the Navy SEALs could reasonably have perceived that the whole house was wired, and therefore anything but a completely unequivocal surrender would almost inevitably lead to Bin Laden's death. And you can kill someone under human rights law if you reasonably apprehend that either you're in danger or in imminent danger or someone else is. But where the argument would fall down in human rights law is you're supposed to have an investigation, and there's absolutely no sign that any independent investigation is going to take place. I mean, the Navy SEALs have already received medals of honour and so on. There's nobody talking about actually investigating, did we need to kill him? And as I said, they have the evidence because they have those cameras.
Well, I put Ben on the spot earlier. I mean, I appreciate the legal arguments, but if you're actually part of a team making a decision about actual choices, suddenly it gets very, very difficult, because none of the choices you face, none of the choices that the President's team faced, the President himself faced, were easy choices. Part of the problem is the relationship between the US and Pakistan, and specifically whether there was not some compromise amongst active or retired members of the Pakistani intelligence services.
I mean, there is an argument that the United States invaded Pakistani sovereignty. That's a strong argument. I suppose in response one could say that I don't think Pakistan has officially complained.
No.
So it's actually up to Pakistan to enforce its rights. There is, we're at kind of the edges of international law here. I mean, it's, especially international law is very good when it comes to arguments between states. When it's a state against a non-state actor, then it's far less clear. Maybe one could argue that Pakistan was either unable or unwilling to arrest Bin Laden, and therefore the United States, in self-defence, had a right to go in. That doesn't necessarily mean they had a right to go in and kill him. But maybe that is an argument. It's an argument that, hasn't flown yet in an international court, but that's because, as I said, we're in fairly new territory here.
We are on the edges of international law in some respects, but I think it's probably more honest to say that there's been a significant breach of international law. I mean, I don't think there's any justification for America's actions under international law. There may be moral arguments. There may be other constructed arguments, but America can say we acted in accordance with the rules of armed conflict. So there was a war. We're in a war on terror, and that war is defined, and we acted in accordance with the rules of international humanitarian law that enabled us to target Bin Laden. He's a legitimate military objective. There was limited casualties of a non-military nature, and that therefore it was a legitimate raid. There's clearly no armed conflict here. The war on terror is a farce. It's an acronym it's a euphemism rather for, we're doing whatever we want to do because we have an awful enemy who's attacking us in ways we're not used to and can't find a way of dealing with. The reality is that it would be a perversion of international humanitarian law to say that the war on terror is a war. The war in Afghanistan's a war. The war in Iraq's a war. The war on terror is not a war. And so there's no armed conflict paradigm within which to say we lawfully targeted Bin Laden, in my view. The argument on self-defence, I agree, there's an argument there, and there's certainly since 9/11, I think since the Security Council resolutions, since collective self-defence actions by NATO in response to terror threats, there seems to be a development in international law to suggest that the law of self-defence, which normally applies only between states, might extend as of between states and non-state actors like a terrorist group. I still don't think that there's any justification under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which sets out the provisions for self-defence on the basis of an ongoing or imminent attack from an enemy that would justify the targeted killing of Bin Laden. So I'd like to, for my part, say that I think that the targeted killing of Bin Laden was a gross and clear violation of international law, and I can't see any legal justification for it.
And it's interesting you say there's just absolutely no armed conflict, because America is clearly operating on that basis.
Absolutely.
And it's fighting, in its view, an armed conflict, not only in Afghanistan, also in Pakistan, now in Yemen, and now it's just started using drones in Somalia.
Yep.
So,
well, just because they say it is so doesn't mean it's so.
Well, the fallback position for them has been this authorisation of the use of force. That there was a presidential edict brought in September 2001, which has been, one could ask whether that very basis for these actions, which has been sort of the the thing that sort of operationalised these missions, in and of itself violates international law. I mean, this is something now that is part of the US legal system that they're using as sort of the...
Well, it's interesting when I've looked back on some of the articles from US papers when Bin Laden was killed talking about legality, and the vast majority talked about legality under US law. And it is legal under US law because of the executive order you're talking about. But that's really irrelevant when it comes to international law. Unfortunately, these papers indicated how irrelevant America feels international law is.
But and to be fair, as you said, we're on the very edge of this area of law. It makes me think of those medieval and earlier maps where you've got the world as we know it, and then at the edges there be monsters. And this seems to be a case where there are certainly monsters at the edge of what we currently know about international law. And leaving law for a minute, Gideon, if you were there in the White House advising the President, the intelligence comes in, they've been tracking for some months, they're fairly certain there's at least a high chance that Bin Laden is in Abbottabad. What would you be pitching to the President in terms of advice for action? Well, and then Jeffrey Robinson?
A more refined version of Jeffrey's argument.
Okay.
I think one has to be realistic about, and I think Ben alluded to this, in fact explained it fairly clearly when he was asked to be an advisor to Obama in similar circumstances.
Turned all hawkish.
Yes. Well, there's a political response to this, and the political response is clear, and that is go in and kill him. Because there is so much risk attached to following the rule of law. And, it's a regrettable thing. It's one of the reasons why I'm not involved in advising governments and would never be, let alone in any way related to politics, because the compromises one has to make are difficult. And they're difficult personal choices and they're difficult moral choices. And the moral choice and the choice to follow the rule of law would require the US administration to pursue an investigation, an arrest and a trial against somebody who would prove very difficult. It would prove very difficult to get your hands on him, prove very difficult to sort out the legal jurisdictional issues, and the US Supreme Court has shown that it's prepared to tackle hard issues and decide against the US government. And we've seen that with Guantanamo Bay, the Military Commissions Act. So all of those things would have to be in the minds of those advising Obama and Obama himself. But legally, one cannot advise that, the targeted assassination of Osama Bin Laden is a lawful act, and that would have to be my advice. I would probably then be sacked and be working in a university.
Yes, and then, there's another whole question then there about, okay, so in your mind it's clear we're breaking the law, but what's the right thing to do? Is the right thing to do always following the law? No, it's not. But if you believe in the rule of law, then you have to do your best to adhere to it. And in this situation, there is ample evidence of very difficult, mixed political and legal issues relating to the trial or the trying of senior political leaders who have committed war crimes and atrocity, including genocide. There's examples of it. It works. There's a system in place. It's not a strong system, it's a difficult system, but it exists and it works, and I'd certainly be recommending we pursue that path. If for no other reason than to say, you may pursue Bin Laden and assassinate him now because he's your enemy. What if, we're talking about China or Russia or some other state that is in a position of being the superpower of the future, whose enemy is something different to what we perceive as an enemy? What would you want them to do in the same situation? If you're not prepared to ask that question in the way that Bush and Rumsfeld and the others weren't prepared to ask that question when they responded to 9/11, then suffer the consequences. Was it worth it? Was Bin Laden that important? Has it made such a difference to take a very risky course, to go out beyond international law and do this thing? Has it achieved something that was worthwhile, Ben?
It depends on which level you're looking at it. I think there's a negligible impact on the capacity, or what remained of the capacity of Al-Qaeda to conduct operations. I don't think that... there are some who would argue that Bin Laden did still have some operational control over the organisation, but I would say not worth it in that way, but worth it in terms of political capital that was gained by Obama. There's all these different levels that it's resonated on. Really depends on where you place your emphasis. I think, for those of us who do place value in international law, particularly because its power is in its normative power. It doesn't have a coercive capacity. So this act, for me, in a lot of ways, is symptomatic of the weakening or the assault on international law that came about, particularly in the lead up to the Iraq War, where its very potency, its very logic was called into question by the Bush administration, and it was the ability with which governments can violate it was enhanced. There's a great cost in the long term that's going to be borne out by acts such as these, but the political value of acts such as these will see them recur, I think.
I'm not sure I agree when you say that Iraq has made it easier to breach international law. I think the United States has lost a lot because of its invasion in Iraq. I think it's lost an enormous amount of authority. Certainly the Bush administration did, and maybe the election of Obama was perceived as, some sort of, new dawn which restored temporarily some of America's authority, but I think it has lost an enormous amount of goodwill around the world. I mean, you're right, international law is the Achilles heel of international law is enforcement. It's extremely difficult to enforce international law against countries, and particularly powerful countries like the United States. But I've already mentioned that certain senior members of the Bush administration, including George Bush, I fully predict that they will find it very difficult, and I don't think they will be travelling very much. That's one thing that's actually, if nothing else, embarrassing. Yeah. But I think they lost an enormous amount of moral authority all over the world because of what they did in Iraq. I don't, however, see the same consequences perhaps coming with the death of Osama Bin Laden, not because it's less illegal or whatever, but I guess it was not, the reaction by the world has not been as much revulsion or as much abhorrence to that act, whereas the war in Iraq was deeply unpopular. That's not to say it was, it's right because it was a popular act, but I think, circumstances have fallen that way for Obama. How would I advise Obama? I think I could only do what Gideon does and advise him on the law. And then find a new job.
Right. Well, there's many advantages to being safe in our ivory towers. Much as we complain as academics, there are some advantages. We're free from having to make those tricky choices. But let's look forward to the future. Whether or not the death of Osama Bin Laden is a tipping point for Al-Qaeda and it becomes less and less powerful, what does seem very clear is that terrorism as a method of political violence, political action, is not going away. And we're going to face this ongoing struggle with groups that use asymmetrical force, small groups, non-state actors, that are really basically competing to try and tell the world we're the good guys, the freedom fighters, they're the bad guys, we're trying to say the reverse. How do we act in a world like this? The rhetoric of global war on terror we know was silly, like the war on drugs. It's not really a war. And yet there is a sense in which we have an active conflict going on. How do we act within the confines of this conflict? What should we be doing when it comes to figures like Bin Laden in future?
We can take a lesson from what has happened, for instance, in the Arab world since December last year, and we look at look at it as a collapse of the influence of that type of politics, Al-Qaeda-style politics in the region, and the resonance of other ideas, ideas about freedom from authoritarianism, etc., etc. So, I mean, that for me, that sends a message of it's not arms that make change. It was ideas. It was ideas and persistence, and certainly resistance and arms are certainly part of it. But it lends itself toward viewing elements of counter-terrorism policy that address those parts of the issue, whether that be issues around de-radicalisation, demobilisation, discussions over ideology and narratives and these sorts of things. And these things are happening amongst governments. I mean, governments are very aware of this. But for me, it reaffirms an already happening trajectory, particularly in counter-terrorism policy.
Well, picking up on your point, Sarah, and Ben's point just then, could we in fact argue that there's grounds for being optimistic, that although we stumble and make many mistakes, we're moving steadily towards a situation where international law has some teeth, and the legitimacy of governments, of individual figures, of individual actors depends very much on how they're seen, judged transparently, that people now are in a position to really ask those questions and will act accordingly?
I mean, it's hard to predict the future, but I think there are some grounds for optimism. We have in a way somehow, there's been a return to some sort of respect for international law. The International Criminal Court, it's not actually doing an enormous amount on the ground, but it's got a very strong symbolic resonance with, Colonel Gaddafi being charged and Bashir from Sudan has been indicted. He hasn't been charged. He hasn't been arrested and so on. So there has been some sort of, he hasn't been arrested, but that doesn't mean he won't be. I mean, Milosevic took a long time. I think there probably is a very real fear amongst some people in the world about, I could be dragged up before the International Criminal Court. So I think there is some sort of tentative return. I do feel the Arab Spring, which is hardly resolved at all, but I do see that also as grounds for enormous optimism. It has been said that, it's showing, the generations in some of the Arab countries that, the way of terrorism is just simply nihilistic and doesn't really achieve anything, whereas what they did in Tahrir Square and what they did in Tunisia actually did achieve something. And I think it's really remarkable, for example, that the Syrians are still going, even though, and they haven't turned to arms yet. I mean, there has, of course, been some, but they haven't turned to arms yet. Neither has Yemen. And Yemen is a country that's been constantly bagged as being, at least prior to its demonstrations, constantly called a failed state. And there was even thoughts that, the Arab Spring could never come to Yemen. I mean, it's got a very low rate of literacy and so on. It's also a highly armed society, and yet after all that, they still haven't turned to arms. And I think that's remarkably resilient, and hopefully they won't. And I see that as huge grounds for optimism.
Well, they haven't turned to arms, and they've been tremendously courageous in all of these countries. Think of the people in Syria at the moment, the sort of threats they face. They also haven't turned to that other kind of arms, extremist religion. I mean, the rhetoric, the narrative of Al-Qaeda is not playing a significant role in these Arab Spring events at the moment.
Yeah, you're 100% right, and I think it's a really beautiful sort of little vignette of that lesson, I think, where, it's that sort of battle over those ideas, and the very fact that it achieved change, the very fact that Mubarak left, for me, in all of this discussion, is 50 times more significant than the death of Bin Laden. I mean, that is a really telling... The fact they came close together is actually really interesting, because it is such a telling comparison, I think.
It also seems telling to me that whilst we've heard some voices from the past, from previous US administrations, saying, see, we told you so, torture works, this current administration's had people like General David Petraeus saying, no, torture can't be justified, waterboarding can't be justified, we didn't get vital intelligence, timely intelligence with this case, and there's no justification for doing it in future. There seems to be a growing realisation that it really does matter what people think of you. And if you don't pay attention to trying to persuade people the right of your cause, you've lost already. Well,
I think the war in Iraq would have been a lot more successful for the United States had it been legal. They would have had more support. And so I think, as I've said, I think there have been subtle but very profound consequences for all of the players. I think the government that seems to have sort of gone right under the radar with regard to Iraq is in fact the John Howard government. That doesn't seem to come up so much in this country. But, I mean, Tony Blair is completely vilified in the United Kingdom, mainly because of that one act. And I do think that, there are consequences for, flagrant breaches of the law. When it comes to Bin Laden, I'm not as strong as Gideon in saying, right, it's a breach. I think it is, but I think it's a bit more complicated in terms of, well, if this, then this, and so on, that it depends a lot on exactly what happened, when. And also, if I make the assumption, if I give them the benefit of the doubt that it was a kill or capture rather than kill. I agree, if it was a kill operation, it was a breach. And so, maybe that's another reason why I don't think it's going to have the same consequences for moral authority. But one of the other speakers, I think it might have been you, Ben, also brought up that also if you continuously breach international law and use things like torture and so on, how can you possibly expect other countries not to do the same? Without, I'm not even, without any... I'm not saying there were great checks and balances in the United States, but there were some. But, in some other countries there'll be absolutely none. And how can you, how can you justify that? How can you tell another country they can't do what you've just done and blatantly done?
Can I pick up on this question of optimism? Is there grounds for optimism? I think there's something going on at the moment that we haven't really touched on tonight at all, but it's fairly significant and sort of, involves a range of the issues we've been discussing, which of course is the conflict in Libya. And I think Libya is a fabulous little example, little microcosm of this issue about whether there's cause for optimism in the future, in the way that the world is responding, the euphemistic international community is responding to these sorts of problems. I thought it was really interesting because the Security Council resolution that led to the attacks in Libya and the support for the rebel forces was predicated on an express statement that there would be no troops on the ground. So there was a sort of limited action. It was also predicated, I think, on a complete lack of honesty about what history tells us about where these conflicts go. And I think it shows the confusion in the international community, or perhaps mixed messages and mixed feelings in the international community about how we are to respond to oppressive governance. Syria and Tunisia and Egypt are nice examples of internally driven rebellions. Libya started as an internally driven rebellion that required international force to reinforce it. But what is to be done about Gaddafi? The first thing that happens is that the Security Council says, well, we're going to refer this matter to the International Criminal Court because the International Criminal Court is the expression of global justice and we believe in it and it can address this issue. So the International Criminal Court is seized, it goes about investigating and ultimately it produces indictments against Gaddafi and others. In the meantime, we then authorise the use of armed force, invoking this idea of humanitarian intervention or the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is this sort of very amorphous international law concept whereby great powers go in and enforce their will upon rogue states. That seems to me to be defensible, quite defensible on the grounds set out in the Security Council resolution, which is the protection of civilians and the civilian population. That's all fine until we then go and target Gaddafi's premises in Tripoli and start trying to assassinate him. And it seems to me there's a really lovely little comparison to be made between the targeted killing of Osama Bin Laden, the attempted targeted killing, which clearly it was, of Muammar Gaddafi. Both of them are illegal for very different reasons. Both of them are an extension of the mission that was granted these governments by international law. And it seems to me that Libya really reflects this confusion in the international community about what it is that we should be doing for troubled regions, the extent to which we should be responding to terrorist groups, to rogue states, to governments that support this sort of behaviour, and the extent to which we should be staying out. I'm not convinced that there's enormous grounds for optimism. I think there's greater grounds for optimism than there was back in, the noughties, if you like. But I don't think that we're clear yet about where it is that we're heading as an international community on this.
Yeah, so much is contingent, isn't it, on who's in government and sort of the flavour of that government, decisions made. I mean, talking about America, we can see that there was a very different administration that made certain choices about Afghanistan and Iraq. Very likely this administration wouldn't have done so. We know that Senator Obama voted against the Iraq invasion, but he's stuck with trying to work out what he's got. I mean, we'll work with what he's got. So.
Would have Obama made different decisions in Afghanistan?
I don't know about Afghanistan. I think that Iraq, it's clear, it's on the record that he...
Yeah.
I mean, Afghanistan's another whole can of worms because we face ongoing engagement, however it plays out, and difficult legal challenges. We're talking about negotiations with some elements of the Afghani Taliban, and that's legally, morally fraught, but also probably inevitable. I mean, it's something we have to face up to. It's a difficult age we live in, isn't it?
Well, it also, just bringing up Afghanistan, one of the arguments which some people raise about why we should stay is, for human rights, to, in particular, protect the rights of women. Well, if we're negotiating with the Taliban, that's not really the outcome I think they're negotiating for, and it's also definitely not the reason we went in the first place. I mean, the Taliban were awful to women for many years before we went in 2001. And so I think that, the argument, we must stay because of the rights of women, whether that's a good argument or not, I think it's a lie. I don't think that's why we're there, and I don't think it's why we're going to stay or leave, especially if we're negotiating with the Taliban. I'd be surprised if those negotiations are all about human rights for women.
No, I think you're right, but we walked away from Afghanistan once. We were sort of involved at arm's length in the 1980s when the Mujahideen, mostly Afghani fighters, fought the Soviets. And then we just washed our hands and said, that's good, it's done. And the troubles we face today are the result of not following through then. So there's a sense, I think...
Unless they're a consequence of getting involved in the first place, which is what you're warning about also with Libya. I mean, Libya, I think, is I mean, I've personally changed my mind on Libya. I mean, when the NATO intervention first started, that was almost, sounds odd, but almost a reinforcement of the rule of law, because unlike with Iraq, they actually did get the Security Council.
And the League of Arab Nations. I mean, the Arab League was really vital in tipping the balance there.
It may, now it seems like the Security Council will most likely pull back. And it's a little win for the rule of law, but there's certainly no talk of, going and bombing other places like Libya, like Syria, for example. Right. Now, maybe that's because it's too logistically difficult. It's also because without the Security Council, it will be illegal. Yep. And the Security Council's not going to, Russia and China aren't going to fall for that again.
Well, being illegal's okay. It just has to be strategically significant and worthwhile, and it's not.
Mm. Well, on that point, let's throw to the floor and see what questions we have. I mean, I'm sure there are thoughts and opinions here. If I could ask you to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, the microphone will come to you.
I've got two questions to kick off. Firstly, looking at the implication of Osama Bin Laden's death through the focus of international law, my feeling from what I've heard tonight is it's not difficult, but it does seem a little sterile. It was against the law. But what about the meaning of the death beyond that discussion? For example, the fact that America's arm is now seen as quite long, that America is virile. It won't navel gaze, but it will avenge its own deaths. And will it make enemies of America think twice? And the second question is, I went to a very good talk recently by Paul Monk, who compared the spectacle of Osama's crimes and death to the crimes and death of Bonnie and Clyde in America in the 1930s. It was great theatre, but it was irrelevant to the 1930s depression and the rise of fascism in Europe and the rise of Imperial Japan. And I'd just like to ask what your thoughts are on that aspect of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we'll start with this question and come back to the others in a minute. Panel?
Well, my feeling is I don't really believe that the fact that ultimately America got Bin Laden, I don't think that that's going to put off many extremists many of whom, have used their own suicide as a means for attacking. So I think this idea of, I won't attack America because ultimately they might come after me, I don't think that's, the other side of that coin is, how powerful is America? And this guy managed to evade capture for 10 years when, the whole country was after him, and not only America but all of its allies. On Bonnie and Clyde, I think there is... I guess the parallel is the idea that ultimately the death of Bin Laden, it might be symbolically important but not particularly important in the broader war on terror. And I'm probably not as qualified as Ben to talk about that, but that seems to be the case. I mean, we're still in Afghanistan. One of the first things Julia Gillard said after congratulating America on the death of Bin Laden was, but this won't change anything regarding our mission in Afghanistan. It's like, okay, why are we there? So I would tend to agree that maybe it's symbolically a bit like Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah, I agree. I'll just comment on that last question. I agree completely that it is a symbolic act. I mean, it's not the type of thing as much to drive people who are already members of extremist organisations. Is not going to, I don't think, radicalise people who mightn't have engaged with that previously. I can't see that happening. So that one leads one to really question the significance of it outside of, say, vaudeville theatre, perhaps.
Well, I'd like to say that the legal response to it is far from sterile, and in fact the legal response to it, and a response which saw his arrest and trial, would have been far more cathartic for the victims of Bin Laden than his targeted assassination. And I've seen this time and time again in my work at the Yugoslav Tribunal with the mothers of Srebrenica, who came, representatives of which came for the first Srebrenica genocide trial, the hearing of that, of the sentence. And in victims who have been able to turn up to these trials, to give evidence, to watch it, to see a dictator, a strong, powerful, evil person deflate and wilt during the trial process. It's one of the great sort of powerful aspects of the trial process is its ability to break down and wilt these, strong and evil people. Rupert Murdoch might be next. I wouldn't compare necessarily Rupert Murdoch to Bin Laden. You might, but this is a very powerful process, and the ability of law to deliver big time on these issues for the victims, to deliver retribution, to deliver some sort of healing is far greater than the ability of the US to send a crack marine team in to slay him and have it be forgotten a couple of months down the track.
I'd like a comment from the panel. If I start with an assumption that the war against terror is really a war for the mind of the moderate Arab Muslim population, should we be looking at what the killing of Bin Laden means in terms of how it affects those people and not how it affects the United States public opinion or things like that? And in those countries, I would put to you that people respect power and strength, and not killing Bin Laden would have been a great disservice in that sort of situation.
Ben, what lessons can we draw from the Arab Spring in terms of what people respect and what they look to in terms of legal process, due process?
I think we sort of touched on that before, but I think those assumptions have kind of been flipped on their head. I mean, what we've seen in the last 6 months is the use of authority and power and fear start to crumble through people. And it's not necessarily saying it's a beautiful democratic spring and this is what's happening, but it's been a breakdown of that logic of politics. And people chose to act, as Sarah was saying before, people in Syria aren't resorting to violence, they aren't resorting to extreme narratives to counter a repressive and brutal regime. So I don't really buy into that argument as such. I don't think this is sort of anecdotal evidence and observational evidence. People in the Arab world didn't really care when he died. I mean, it was an important issue and it was sort of a significant issue, but it wasn't as big an issue as the continuing political conditions they were living under. Bin Laden didn't represent them, didn't represent their wishes. He was a very marginal figure. So I think we've got to be very careful not to conflate his influence in the region.
In fact, I think one of the lessons from the Arab Spring is that people in there are people just like us. I mean, they have the same expectation and desires. Their value system, what they're hoping to achieve, is not alien. It's very familiar. And that's unfortunately the note in which we conclude, because 90 minutes have flown by and we haven't solved the world's problems, but we've had a good look at them. Thank you very much.
Cheers.